Hey guys, I'm back with continuing my series about how I earned my IM norms. In this video I'll be talking about my second norm, which I got at the 2015 North American Open. So I got my first norm. If you haven't seen that video, do check it out first. Previously in 2014 at the Spice Cup, which took place I think in October 2014. This tournament was basically December 2015. So it was a little bit over a year after getting my first norm that I was able to get my second one. Now at the time my rating of this tournament was 2360, so I had gone up a little bit. I had a pretty good year overall, and I think I was getting close to norms a couple times in 2015, so I definitely felt like, I could get another one soon. This tournament I remember being a lot more volatile than the last one. I started off with a win over a 2066, and then I scored actually my first big upset of the tournament, defeating an international master who is probably Grandmaster now or soon to be. I then lost a game to GM Mikolas, got one back, a little bit lucky. I remember winning this game against Gregory Markson in round 4, lost to Darwin Yang, beat Grandmaster James Tarjan. And then I drew with Andrew Tang. He was an IM back then, so he wasn't quite as good as he is now. Then I drew with Nikolas Chica, another young, very, very strong player. And in the final round, I needed to draw against International Master Shmelov, which was not a very long game, but a pretty nerve-wracking game because there was, of course, a lot riding on the line. So yeah, this was an open tournament, so there's quite a bigger field than the previous norm tournament. And in open tournaments, you really have to start well because otherwise you're likely to just get pared down a lot, which really drags down your rating and makes it harder to achieve the norm. Here I ended up getting it with 5.5 out of 9 points, which I think is typically pretty low. Most norms are 6 points, 6.5, but of course the average rating of my opponents was quite high. So in this video, I just wanted to show a couple of the critical moments from this tournament. The first one came in round 2 against International Master Island Nakar. And this was a pretty interesting game. I was playing white, it was a King's Indian. And we reached the critical position here around move 42, where I definitely felt like I had a big advantage in the position, but I really didn't know how to proceed any further. Now my knight on e6 is one of the strongest knights the chess world has ever seen, but if black is simply going to ignore the knight was very difficult for me to figure out what to do with it. Of course, if black captures the knight with any of his pieces, then after f takes e6, my bishop will open up and black's king will just be way too weak. But if black ignores the knight, I actually wasn't seeing how to break through. In the game, I ended up taking a big risk here because I don't remember if my opponent offered a draw here or what, but he was essentially just moving back and forth. Rook e7, rook e8. He just had nothing to do. He had no good pawn breaks, no way to improve his position. So he was just waiting for me to see how I'm going to try to break through. And I honestly just couldn't find a good plan. Then I turned on the engine just recently on this position just to see, what modern engines would think. And Stockfish gives it about 1.5 for white, but every move is 1.5. So it's like Stockfish didn't really offer me such a clear plan. Maybe I need to go in and analyze a little bit deeper and try some ideas out myself. But for the most part, the engine was suggesting white to just keep shuffling and enjoy the space advantage, but without making any real progress. Well, in the game, I ended up taking a big risk here with the move knight takes c7. This is definitely a sacrifice, and I felt like I should be getting at least a draw in this sacrifice in these lines, so I felt justified to go for this. And it certainly did take a little bit of gumption to take a risk, because obviously I could have just made a draw. Drawing against a high-rated player is a good result, but I felt like, if I can enter some lines where black has some options to mess up and probably some saving ideas as well, then as long as I'm not risking to lose, I should still play it and test my opponent. I don't remember the exact timing of the situation, but I believe my opponent was running low on time somewhere around here. I could be wrong, but I do think time trouble or time pressure certainly played a factor. So white's idea is after rook takes e3, queen takes e3, queen takes e7, to play the infiltrating move queen e7. So this is kind of my key idea. Now black is kind of paralyzed here. The bishop is pinned to the queen. I'm threatening to take the f6 pawn and then simply launch a devastating attack against black's king. I want to go queen g6 check, f6, open up my bishop, get the pawn included. And if I get these moves, I think it's just going to be a mating attack. So I felt like black had only one reasonable defense here, which ends up playing either queen b8 or queen c8. Queen b8 makes a little bit more sense just to keep an eye on the d6 pawn. And then after queen takes f6, queen to f8, simply covering as many squares as possible with the queen. Stockfish actually points out a much better way for black to hold the position. And that was the shot knight takes b3, which I don't think I considered during the game at all. I didn't even realize this was possible, to be honest. The point is, after bishop takes b3, bishop takes f5, white is losing the queen, so I would have to play queen takes f6. And the engine's idea is that after bishop takes a4, black is now creating counterplay, the queen is covering along the 7th rank, and white better hurry up and make perpetual takes, queen g7 and queen d8, and at this point white has nothing better than to just repeat moves. So that was probably a much cleaner way for black to force a draw, but of course both me and my opponent likely overlooked that one. Instead he goes for the more natural defense, queen b8, queen takes f6, queen f8. I gave queen g6 check, and he goes queen g7. He's basically forced to give up the d6 pawn. If black goes king h8 here, then white pushes f6, and black just doesn't have a great defense here. If queen g8, then queen takes h6 check. So he goes queen g7. I was anticipating this as the only move. I played queen takes d6, and this was basically the position I had calculated to when I played knight takes c7. So I was trying to figure this out. To me it looked decent, but I thought objectively black probably has some kind of draw somewhere, some kind of defense. But I also felt like I have almost zero losing chances just due to the amount of resources that white has, of course, with the f-pawn, with the active queen, with all of black's pawns hanging. At a certain point, if I take enough pawns, I can just go into the endgame with a bunch of pawns for the piece, where again, I shouldn't be risking to lose. As it turns out, this position ends up being really difficult for black. There was a defense, but it was quite difficult to see. I mean, I certainly wasn't considering the move king f7 during the game. I'm not sure my opponent was either. But again, I believe he was definitely approaching some kind of time trouble here, which of course makes the defense here much more difficult. The point of this move is that it's basically the only move that stops f6. Black gets the king involved into the defense, but obviously this is a very unnatural move, and after queen takes b6, I think black has to find queen d4, which is again not very human, allowing queen g6 check and all this stuff, but according to the Stockfish it does hold, so who am I to argue? Instead, black played queen to c3, which I think is a very natural move, but it ends up losing, mainly because it actually doesn't contain such a serious threat. Of course, knight takes b3 is a threat, but it's not a threat yet. Only after that is queen a1 actually going to be a threat. And if queen e1 check, then I'm going to go king a2, and again, black has no immediate threats there. So I went ahead and played queen g6 check, king f8, f6, and now the attack is just winning. I'm threatening mate in 2. He went queen e1 check, king a2, and here black ended up resigning because he just has no way of covering all of the threats. Now my main threat is just queen g7 and then pushing the pawn and promoting, and black just isn't able to create any serious counterplay. So I was really happy with winning this game. This is something that I think I was not able, to really do for quite a long time. Willing to take such a big risk, sacrificing a piece. I felt like I should have enough in the position, but it's not like I 100% always had a perpetual in my pocket. That would obviously be very, very safe. Here I just felt like my evaluation of the position was good. It turns out that, yeah, black never had more than a draw, so of course it was a great practical chance, and in this game it ended up working out. The next critical game that really helped me achieve the norm in this tournament was my game against Grandmaster James Tarjan. Here white's last move was queen c2, and at this point I decided to go ahead and take on f4. Now this was of course the King's Indian, and in the King's Indian this capture e takes f4 is typically pretty double-edged. The pluses is that of course it opens up black's bishop on g7, and if white takes back with the pawn, then white's king ends up being slightly weakened. But the drawback, of course, is that once white does go g takes f4, I have surrendered quite a bit of central space here. And now white's central pawns, if they get going, could potentially just run me over. But I go ahead and play bishop h3. This was kind of my idea. The point is to trade off white's light square bishop. Not that this bishop is particularly strong, but it is a very important defender, and black is also behind on space, so it did feel kind of important to do this. He goes f5. I think this is a very aggressive move. I take on g2, king takes g2, and I play knight to g4. I think the engine was liking the move c6 here, which makes a lot of sense, just trying to open up the center and creating a lot of counterplay, especially along the c-file. But I kind of like the idea I came up with, because I play knight g4 here, hitting the bishop. He played bishop d4, which I was more or less expecting. And now if I trade bishops on d4, he's going to go knight takes d4. And I felt like this is not a great situation for black. Even though I get the e5 square, I just felt like there was a lot of pressure against my king now that I gave up the dark square bishop. But instead my point was to play bishop f6, which I think is a pretty cute tactical motive here. Now if bishop takes f6, I'm not going to recapture. I actually have knight e3 check, just winning the game on the spot. But on the other hand, I'm attacking the knight on h4, so white is not really able to stay so active. He goes h3 here. I decide to jump back knight to e5, and now he takes on e5. I think this probably wasn't such a great decision. Probably he should have gone knight to f3, but this means that white has to sacrifice an exchange after knight takes f3. The best move here would be bishop takes f6, king takes f3, just looks very risky. And this is actually a very interesting exchange sacrifice. I think with the dark squares here, white would have more than enough compensation. But of course white does have to be willing to give up material here. Maybe for this reason he decided to instead play bishop takes e5. I'm not sure. But now after d takes e5, I'm still hitting the knight on h4. My dark square bishop is blocked off, but I'm also hitting this pawn on f5, and at some point I'm going to be ready to take it. And that actually happens on the next move. He goes knight f3, I go g takes f5, and now this is just a pawn for black. I mean, it's kind of a thematic pawn sacrifice, and my king does get opened up a little bit, but I didn't feel like my king was going to be any weaker than white's king necessarily, especially not with a passive but pretty good defensive dark square bishop. Now, of course, if white takes on f5, I can take with the knight or the queen, but I don't think this is what white wants to do, where black's pieces just start to activate. So he goes knight g3, which I think was a decent try. I push f4, keeping the extra pawn, and now knight f5. Maybe this was a mistake. I think knight h5 was slightly more annoying. I was going to go bishop h8, which definitely looks ugly, but I just didn't see how I was losing here after king h2, king h7. Rook g1, and I think this is a position I was spending a little bit of time analyzing, and I just didn't see what white is doing after queen d7. I didn't see any threats. I thought I'm getting rook g8 next move and challenging for the g-file, and that everything would be okay. And indeed, black is definitely better there, but maybe objectively it's still better than the game. He goes knight f5, I play king h7, just keeping everything stable. Now knight takes e7, I would just take back, and then if knight takes e5, I have rook g8 check, followed by queen to h3 potentially, or if the king is going to h2, I might have bishop h4, bishop g3, which looks very annoying, or even bishop d6 in that position with the king on h2, attacking the knight and x-raying towards the king. So this was definitely just, I think, way too dangerous for black to enter, or for white to enter. Instead he goes king h2, just getting his king off of the g-file as well. Rook to g8. Once again, and now if knight takes e7, bishop takes e7, knight takes e5. Actually, I think this was possible in the other line as well. Black can go rook g3, and it doesn't seem like white is going to have a great defense to the h3 pawn. But again, bishop h4 I think is quite strong as well. So he goes rook g1, challenging for the g-file, queen d7, rook takes, rook g1. At this point, I think he is trying to equalize because white just doesn't have full compensation for the pawn. But I have no problem with trades here because of the material advantage. And I find a nice idea here with knight takes f5, ef, and then b5. Simply just creating counterplay, putting more pressure on white's position. My bishop on f6 is still passive, but again, rock solid and defending my extra pawn, which is nice. And now I'm just initiating counterplay on the queen side. So he goes b3, I play c6, and I'm just trying to trade off some pawns just to open up some space for my queen. I would love to get control over the light squares and one day push e4 through, and I felt like that would be kind of like my winning condition in this game. He goes queen e4, playing for the blockade, cd, cd, queen c7, and the position is definitely bad for white, but I don't think it's that easy to break through here for black. But he does end up giving me a little bit of a gift here. After check, king g2, queen b2 check. He should have just gone king f1, just kind of repeating, and then I can choose between taking this pawn or maybe just playing like a more solid move like king g7. And I think black has a winning advantage here, but it's still not easy. I mean, white has a d pawn that is, going to have to be carefully defended against, and yeah, I'm sure all three results are actually still possible, but objectively black is better. Instead, he ends up going queen to d2. I think at this point he was in pretty heavy time trouble, just relying on the increment. If I remember correctly, maybe he had a few minutes left, but this ends up just being a tactical blunder after the move e4. Now opening up the bishop against my queen and threatening to take the knight with check, and so this is a big problem for white. He simply has nothing to do. He's just losing a piece. The knight is also critically defending the queen, so he can't move away. And then after queen takes b2, e takes f3 check. White just resigned here because king takes f3, bishop takes b2, black is going to be up a piece, and white just doesn't have nearly enough in this endgame. Black's king is just going to come back and round up the d-pawn and then slowly win with the extra piece. So I felt a little bit fortunate to win this game, but overall I thought I played really well. I put my opponent under pressure, and I was willing to just grab a pawn when I felt like he wouldn't have enough compensation and then hold on to it. So I really felt like I kind of played in a principled manner in this tournament. It didn't work out in all the games. I lost a couple of games as well. But for the most part, I think taking risks and being aggressive is often going to work out in your favor. And if it doesn't, well, my philosophy is that you can learn from it. So the next critical game, I would say, came in round 8 against Nikolas Chica, who I think actually at the time was not yet an IM, despite being over 2,400 FIDE. Now, of course, he's a pretty strong GM, so he's really gone up. And if I remember correctly, I had already done some norm math, trying to figure out, how many points I'm going to need to finish in order to be eligible for the IM norm. Of course, you need a performance rating of 2450. So I think usually once you get to round 7, I would probably advise people not to calculate or worry about it before round 7. But once you finish round 7 and you're doing well, then this would be the time to try to figure out how many points you're likely going to need in the final round. You should probably just make a video about how to do these calculations. They're really not that hard. It's just a matter of looking up the average rating needed for each score. So for instance, if you're going to be scoring 5.5 points out of 9, your opponents need to be, I think, at least an average of 23 something, maybe 2350, 2360, something like that. The more points you score, the lower average rating your opponents need to be in order to calculate the performance rating that you're getting at the end of the tournament. And the reason you do it after round 7 is because you're usually going to be able to see your round 8 opponent. You can see their rating. You can include their rating in your calculations. And based on that, you can kind of determine, okay, well, if I win this game, my performance rating will be so-and-so. And my final round opponent can be any rating from this to this in order to keep the average rating to what I need to be. So, for example, I believe in this tournament I needed 5.5 points based on the average rating of my opponents. Had I won this game, I would have gone into that 5.5 mark, and then my last round opponent, who was likely to be at least 24, maybe even 2,500, as long as they were some reasonable rating, like above 2,300, I wouldn't even need to score that game to get the norm. So it's very important, in my opinion, to know what you need for the norm. Of course, there is also advice to just try to forget about it as much as possible. But if getting a norm is your focus and that's what you came there to do, then I think this kind of calculation is very useful. So going into this game, I knew that if I won this game, that would basically clinch my norm outright. And I felt like, well, this was a good opportunity. I was expecting to get a King's Indian. King's Indian's a great opening to play for a win with black. And I was certainly looking to take my chances in this game if they were presented to me. If I draw this game, then I knew I would very, very likely need to draw my final round in order to get the score needed for a norm. So going into the game, my last move in this position was the move h4. I felt like black is was slightly better in this endgame with the pair of bishops here, and white having a lot of pawns on the light squares that are potential targets for my light squared bishop. Objectively, the endgame is equal. White should have played something like rook f1, just taking control over the only open file, and things are very, very close to balance. But my opponent here, I think, starts playing very ambitiously, which ended up in my favor. And he goes king f2 here, with the idea of bringing the king over to the queen side. So I think he was basically trying to induce rook f8 check, and just kind of arguing that the rook is not going to be able to do anything along the f-file. This is actually a typical way to play when you're playing for the win, just by keeping more pieces on the board, not trading off rook so easily. But he probably just missed a resource I had here. So after rook f8, king e1, I just play h3. I think maybe he overlooked this move because it actually isn't such a natural move. This is more of a tactical idea, not positional. Strategically, I don't want to trade these pawns here as black, because after g takes, bishop takes h3, let's say king e2 for example, he wants to put the king on d3, knight comes to c4. Suddenly the king side has been completely liquidated, and my pieces on the king side are just not going to be effective at all. In fact, it's white's pieces on the queen side that are going to be decisively active, and now white is going to be able to create this passed pawn. The knight on c4 is going to stand perfectly, and my bishop on my light squared bishop and my dark squared bishop in particular are going to feel like they have nothing to do. But instead of taking on h3, instead I have a much stronger move, bishop f3. So of course this is the idea of playing h3 and distracting the pawn on g2. And now I'm able to recapture a much more important pawn, the pawn on e4, after which the pawn on d5 also looks incredibly loose. So he's not able to defend this pawn at all. He ends up playing knight d3, bishop takes e4, and now rook d1. I think it's a good defensive try. He's kind of defending the pawn on d5 tactically, because that's going to set up some kind of discovered attack with knight takes e5, for example. I end up playing bishop d8 here. I think this is an interesting move. I'm trying to get the bishop to a5, where it'll be active and also blockading white's pawns. I think a better move though was just a simple rook f3, king d2, rook takes h3, where white's entire position is under pressure. My rook is going to be active via rook h2 check soon, and yeah, of course the d5 pawn is eventually going to fall. So this is, I think, a much simpler way to convert the advantage, but I think what I did for the moment was still okay. So he goes knight f2, bishop c2, rook a1, and bishop a5 check. I think this is actually a dubious move. And this is one of those moves that I think a lot of players would make in this situation, where we played bishop d8, our idea was bishop a5, and so now that we have an option to play, we might as well play it. But it was actually just much stronger to play bishop b3 first, and then just take the pawn on d5. And what I underestimated here was that after bishop a5 check, king e2, bishop b3, well, I've actually opened up the way for white's rook to go to the g file. And after rook g1 check, suddenly I realized that I've done the one thing I was trying not to do. I've allowed my opponent some counterplay. This is always the inner dialogue that I have during the game when I'm winning. I'm always telling myself, don't allow counterplay, don't allow counterplay, but still in this respect, I totally failed. The point is that regardless of where I move my king, white's knight is coming to e4 next, threatening the d-pawn, which is going to be difficult to defend, as well as threatening knight g5 ideas. So if I go king f7, knight e4, this is just a somewhat unpleasant position already, because the d6 pawn is hanging with check. White has ideas of knight g5 check, rook f1, bishop h6, and then rook g7 ideas, and basically I'm just under pressure. I'm still going to be able to win the d5 pawn, but if I have to give up the d6 pawn as well, then my whole structure is going to collapse. So I end up playing king h7. I think this was the best choice. White goes knight e4, and then I take on d5. Which ends up being the move that definitely costs me the win. What I should have done to keep an advantage was throw in another check, bishop c4. In this case, throwing in this check is useful because white is forced to play king d1, and then after bishop takes d5, this d6 pawn is actually untouchable. Knight takes d6, rook d8, followed by a discovered attack. And I think white is actually just losing a lot of material here. Probably the best try is something like bishop takes c5. But we have bishop b3 check, we have bishop b6 ideas, and I think white is just basically lost here. Black is going to be winning material very, very soon after one of these moves. Probably the easiest is bishop b6, looking at it now. Bishop takes b6, a takes b6, and the knight just doesn't have any good squares. Knight f5 is going to run into discovery. So here I just didn't notice the nuance. I took on d5, he goes knight takes d6, and I played bishop f3 check, king d3, rook to d8. This was kind of my idea. I thought I still have some pressure here, but after bishop takes c5, it turns out that black just has nothing. This move, bishop b6, is possible, but it doesn't work. After bishop takes b6, rook takes d6, white has king e3 and is going to be taking a piece as well. And then actually I think white is better with an extra pawn here. So I actually ended up being a little bit lucky not to lose this game, because what we ended up getting was I started pushing my e-pawn. Of course, at this point, we're both in pretty heavy time trouble. I don't think there was a 30-second increment in this tournament. I'm pretty sure it was some kind of like 10-second delay. And yeah, I mean, the position just gets way out of control. I'm actually lucky to have rook c8, because when you play knight f7, he's starting not just the rook, but also knight g5. So rook c8, knight g5, king h6, takes. And we end up in this rook and bishop versus rook and knight endgame, where I'm down a pawn, but I do have a very, very strong e3 pawn. Actually, during the game, I wasn't even sure whether I should still be playing for the win here or just trying to hold and make sure I don't lose. It's always hard to tell, but objectively, I think only white can really be better here. Eventually, what it came down to was me sacrificing my bishop for white's remaining pawns. After a5 here, I played rook takes b5, a takes b6, a takes b6. This was already me trying to force a draw, because I felt like it was too dangerous to keep playing. If I move my bishop back, I'm going to have to deal with ideas like b6, a takes b6, a6, where white's a pawn just becomes incredibly strong. So I was worried if I don't give up my bishop now, I'm eventually going to have to give up a rook. So I decided to just kind of force the draw here, where I knew I'm going to be getting white's last pawn. And actually, my opponent here decided to torture me for quite a bit. He ended up winning, of course, the e-pawn. He won the b6 pawn very quickly as well. And then he played out rook and knight versus rook for quite some time. This was definitely a little frustrating for me, because I had been winning earlier in the endgame, and I recognized that I had a huge advantage. Of course, the norm was also on my mind, so I was thinking like, this is it, just win this game and it's over. And unfortunately, I just messed it up in some kind of time pressure. So I was a little bit frustrated that I had to now defend this endgame, rook and knight versus rook. Also, I only had the 10-second delay, I think maybe 1 minute left at this point. But what I've learned is that this endgame is actually not that hard to hold for the rook here. It's much easier compared to rook and bishop versus rook, for example. Both endgames are objectively drawn, but I think this one has a much wider drawing range. Even if you don't know any ideas, as long as you just play intuitively and don't blunder into any mates or forks, you can still hold, as long as you're just trying to prevent your opponent from making progress. So we ended up playing like 50-55 moves here. Eventually I claimed the draw, and that was the end of the game. So that was kind of a bummer, because that was a very, very long game that didn't end up in my favor. I only was able to draw this game, and that meant that in the final round I would need to draw as well in order to clinch the norm. Now, I was expecting to get white in the last game, but I ended up, for some reason, getting a double black, which was also frustrating, but you play the hand you've been dealt, or whatever they say. Obviously I couldn't complain about the pairings, and I just figured, well, okay, I guess I'm going to play another King's Indian to get my norm. The King's Indian was one of the openings I picked up not too long before this tournament. I think actually I started playing it around 2015, maybe early 2015. I started studying it, so I was definitely very excited to play this opening, and I was almost looking forward to just the challenge of holding my ground, not backing down, not playing something more solid like a Nimzo, because all I needed was a draw, but just playing my chess and trying to play the best moves I could. So my opponent here was a pretty strong international master, Denis Shmelov. He ends up playing the classical variation here, and I'll just breeze through the opening. I play knight a6, bishop e3, c6, white goes d5. This is a pretty theoretical line. It's one that I've played a couple times. And in this line, we end up getting quite an interesting structure where black ends up playing both e5 and c5, and then this weird move f6. So it does feel like it's actually a little bit harder for white to make progress in this position on the queen side, mainly because in order to induce all these moves, white had to play bishop g5, bishop h4, and the bishop is not really active on the queen side. Instead, it's on the king side, but the pro for white here is that this bishop is actually making it hard for black to advance the f-pawn. So now black has to make some funky maneuvers with the queen in order to get the f-pawn moving. Overall, I think it's a very, very strategically rich position, and I felt like I had good experience here, so I didn't really mind getting this during the game. Actually, this game did not last super long. We both kind of made natural moves for this position. I improved my bishop by playing bishop h6. He goes back, preventing bishop e3 check. I get my f-pawn push. White plays b4, black goes b6, rook b1, bishop d7. King h1, definitely a useful move for the future. King h8, I just follow suit. He plays knight b5, and finally I decide to just shut things down with f4. So whenever black makes this move in the King's Indian, it's always like a committal move. It means I'm no longer looking for any kind of pressure on e4, knight g5 ideas, nothing like that. My only idea now is to push g5, g4, rook g8, g3, and just try to break through on the king side in classic King's Indian fashion. I actually felt pretty good about my position here, and I was already looking forward to just mating my opponent. Not that I was feeling super confident, but I didn't really see why this position should be dangerous for black. White doesn't have any obvious breakthrough ideas, and yeah, to me it just looked like a nice King's Indian. So he goes bishop to e1. This is typical moves to allow the knight to jump to f2 and cover the g4 square. I push g5, b takes c5, and I play knight takes c5. This is a typical recapture for black, because otherwise this knight on a6 is really just not doing a whole lot. But here, if white wants to break through, he really has to. He basically has to trade off this bad knight. And here he actually surprised me. He played knight takes c5 and offered a draw. And somewhat surprisingly, I actually thought about it for a little bit, like at least a few minutes here. The reason I thought about it was because, you know, I wasn't expecting the draw offer. So my opponent, you know, I know he's an ambitious player. He's higher rated than me. He's playing white. I think, you know, if he wins this game, he might be eligible for some small prize. I'm not sure. So I really wasn't expecting to get a draw offer. I thought he's just gonna, you know, try to beat me as normal. But at the same time, during the game, I also felt like my position was just good. So when he, you know, I was expecting to just play the game out, you know, maybe I win, maybe I don't, whatever, but I liked my position. So when he offered me a draw after knight takes c5, obviously, I immediately wanted to take it because of the norm, but at the same time, I thought like, well, you know, if I'm like better here, maybe I should just play on. You know, I think I had the idea of Magnus in the Sinkfield Cup playing on against Aronian, even though a draw would have clinched him the title. He did the same thing in his first World Championship match, where he could have forced a draw against Anand and just ended the match, but he decided to play on because he felt like he was better, he could win the game. So I had these foolish ideas in my mind, like I should play on and try to like win the game and just earn the norm in style. But eventually I realized, okay, like if I take this huge risk, you know, I've come all this way, I've traveled to all these tournaments. If I end up losing just because I wanted an extra half point in the tournament, some extra rating points, I just felt like that would be really, really foolish. And eventually I did take the draw. Had I accepted the game and played something like b takes c5 here, I mean, I think black is slightly better. Even Stockfish likes black's position. And that is saying quite a bit, because Stockfish typically hates the King's Indian and always thinks white is better. So the fact that Stockfish already thinks that black has a small edge means that probably black has a bigger edge in practice. And of course, the attack does look very strong. So, okay, next time I'm going to play on the position, but when I don't have such a huge result on the line. But I think just taking the second norm was, of course, the right decision. So that wraps up this video. That's how I was able to earn my second norm. I think it was a little bit more nerve-wracking this time than the first one. And in the next video, I'll be discussing how I earned my final norm, which is probably the most nerve-wracking of them all. All right, until next time, take care.